We were on a Blackout mission in Alaska when we found something that didn't belong on any map. I say we because there were 9 of us that night, too small a number for what followed, but big enough then to feel like a team. I still wake up to the sound of the cold air catching on my teeth, hearing it like it was then. That's why I'm telling this now. Decades later, the shape of that night won't leave me alone. Guilt, duty, and the faces of men who never left the snow, they keep pulling me back. If nothing else comes of this, I want their names remembered by someone who wasn't there. The mission was simple in paperwork and complicated in reality. A Blackout recon to assess an isolated sector of the Taiga near the interior's western edge. We were to go dark. No comms, no lights beyond infrared, no signatures. The idea was to test our ability to operate when every electronic thing we relied on could be taken away. The irony of what that darkness revealed has followed me ever since. We moved out from a small forward outpost under polar twilight, the kind of light that makes the world look wrong. Everything flattened, long shadows that don't match any shape you know. Our sergeant, McCrae, was a man who'd been in more places than he'd let on. Quiet when he needed to be, and sharp when he had to be. Lieutenant Daniels was new to field command, his brass still bright, his map folds cautious. The rest of us were a mix of seasoned hands and younger bodies eager to prove they belonged. The ground there is deceptive, a surface of hard-packed snow that hides peat and roots and frozen hummocks. Evergreen trees stand needle-like against the wind. Rivers Ferris and unnamed creeks wind like dark veins. You learn quickly that sound behaves differently in cold. It doesn't travel as far. It strikes and dies. The silence was the first thing that felt wrong. Not the expected cold hush, but a deadening that swallowed our breath and the creak of our harnesses. Even the predators seemed to have agreed to stay away. We joked about it to keep from feeling exposed, the way men do, but the jokes were brittle. We'd been briefed that local trappers and hunters had been less than friendly, kept to themselves, avoided our outpost. That was the kind of thing that gets tacked on to a mission brief with a shrug. Cultural differences, territorial pride, superstition. We ran into one trapper on our way out, a lean man whose face had been salted by wind and sun. He looked at us like he saw through the fabric of our machines and orders. He didn't tell us stories. He told us one line. Nothing poetic, nothing theatrical. Don't be out there when it's quiet. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. McCrae offered the kind of polite dismissal you give a civvy when you know you're untouchable. Daniels nodded and checked his watch. I remember thinking then that the kind of silence that keeps people home is often the kind that keeps things alive.
Our strict blackout meant we used hand signals and prearranged light cues through NVG lenses. For the first 6 hours, we moved clean and efficient. We crossed a frozen creek where the ice was thin. McCrae sent a runner to check each rung while the rest of us hugged tree lines. The landscape was a study in whites and grays, the smell of sap and cold metal. Time had a different texture, measured counts in a whisper, breathing synced with step cadence. The first sign that whatever this was had been there already came where the snow was thinnest. There were tracks, large, pressed deep into the moss and soft earth beneath the frost. Not just big, but the shape of them was off. Not like a bear's broad pad, not like a moose's cloven hoof. They were longer than a man's foot, a wide, flat impression that punched through the frost into the peat below, as if something had hammered the surface. The toes, if they were toes, were spaced like talons and curved inward. I remember my first stupid thought. Someone made snowshoes and forgot to return them. We followed them because that's what soldiers do. You follow a thing to find out what it is. The tracks led away from the trail we had been on, into a stand of older spruce, where the canopy pressed down and the ground smelled like rot held in ice. The tracks were fresh. The edges had not yet collapsed. They were too far apart for a human stride. McCrae's jaw tightened. Daniels took a photograph with a handheld. He was methodical, marking bearings in his log. We were careful at first to be professional. That lasted until we found the first body. It was near a deadfall, half under a twisted spruce, the kind of place animals hide old bones. At first, the shape could have been a moose. Then McCrae knelt, and you could see the uniform. Scouting gear, muted, frostbitten face, an identification patch that matched our outpost, an Allied observational post scout. His rifle lay 10 feet away, still slung, intact. His pack was zipped. There was no blood in the open. The way his ribs sat, collapsed, wasn't the work of bullets. The skin, where you could see it, was pallid and waxy, the lips dark with cold. His hand had curled, fingers bent like they'd been pressed into the snow with force. We moved with the practiced respect we use at home for the dead. Daniels barked, then softened, calling for a status check. We were all careful not to say too much, because talking loud in that hush felt obscene. The trapper's warning sat at the back of my mind like a weight I kept checking on. We scoured the immediate area for tracks that would tell a story. Around the body, the snow had disruptions, long slashing marks on the underbrush, like a hand had pulled straight through limbs. The bark on lower trunks was ripped in 2 places about human height, but with a breadth no human would possess. The tracks returned, taller than the tree's lower branches, a stride that bridged gaps a man would have to run to cross.
The impression of weight was everywhere. The earth below was compressed. It was Daniels who found the other thing first, a smear, faint at first, like the crusted metallic smell you get when iron oxidizes and the cold hasn't washed it away. It was more the smell than the sight that made McCrae's face shift. We were trained to look for tracks and sign, but this was a different register. There was something in the air that set your teeth on edge, like the metallic aftertaste of a mouthful of bad memory. We covered the body and moved on because orders insisted forward motion. But the forward motion was a different animal now. The easy confidence we had at the start was gone like the disappearing tail of a comet. And then the radios died. Not the controlled blackout we practiced, not the soft test we were running. Our net went dead as if someone had pinched the wires at the source. We attempted checks with the handhelds. Dead. The lieutenant's PTT click answered nothing. There was no hiss, no carrier, no chatter. The men moved by gestures that were practiced and precise. McCrae ordered us into a tight staggered column, 1 up, 1 down, scanning. We tried to patch things through with a prearranged short burst, the kind of thing you use in jams, but nothing returned. For a team trained to rely on network knowledge, the sudden individualization felt like being stripped of armor. If you ask me now whether I believed in legends before that night, I'd say I was skeptical in a practical way. Skepticism like armor, useful and necessary. But when the radios went quiet and the trees seemed to listen, the trapper's single sentence became a bell in my head. Within an hour, the animals had become less frequent. We didn't hear the distant knock of a woodpecker or the thin shriek of ptarmigan. Even the breeze seemed reluctant to pass through the stand. It didn't rattle needles, it didn't carry sound. We found more tracks as twilight swallowed the sky. They circled out and back, weaving as if patrolling a boundary. In one place, 3 tracks converged and then diverged in a way that suggested deliberation. There were marks on trees, deep gouges at chest height, like someone had tried to carve their name into the trunk with a hand the size of a chair. We started to carry an extra level of equipment because the mission geometry had changed from recon to survival. More ammo, more flares, spare batteries. McCrae ordered tighter spacing and no single man exposed during movement. The moment of first contact was stupid in its suddenness. It was one of those things I still replay, every sliver of it, because replaying is a way to keep the dead company. We were making a short crossing between 2 ridgelines, a narrow opening with a stand of low spruce to our right. Daniels was at the front, his silhouette against the faint sky. He was checking the map when the sound came. Not a growl, not a roar, but a low pressure thrum that vibrated the hollows of our teeth.
It started as the kind of noise you feel in your bones, and then found its way into your chest, like somebody had opened a second set of lungs in the world. The first shot, someone fired reflexively. That's what happens when instincts outrun thought. The round echoed thinly and died. Then the light in the trees moved in a way any predator would. Except it wasn't a blur through branches. It unfolded slowly and with intent, a pale shape tall as a man bearing down in a way no man should move. I saw it in pieces, the longness of limbs, the way its shoulders rolled under some thick hide, the way the snow didn't spatter but compacted under its step. When the moon brushed the thing in a single line, I saw a face that wasn't a face so much as an arrangement of bone under skin, a pale mask with eyes spaced too wide. There was no fear in it. There was a calculation that was colder than the wind. Conventional fire did something. It slowed the motion in places where it hit, but the effect was more like irritating a beast than stopping it. Daniel screamed, a clean, short sound, and then he was shoved backwards like a rag, his pack snagging on a stump. There were snaps, bones breaking, that made a sound I have tried not to carry in my sleeps. McCrae barked commands, and we reacted because we had no choice. We tried to form a perimeter, but the thing moved like a predator that had learned ambush. It wasn't random fury. It came for us with choices. Up close, the creature smelled of old iron and sour animal hide, like a hunter smoker left in the sun too long. It moved with a terrible purpose. In the brief seconds that made a lifetime, we realized it wasn't alone. My head counted the impressions that ran through the underbrush, and they were methodical. One hit the perimeter, another disappeared, and then a third came at the trail we were on, close enough to see its hands. Not claws, not exactly. Thick fingers with blunt ends, the nails worn into callus-like pads. When it grabbed at the canvas of a pack, it tore it like a child rips at paper. There was no finesse. There was a ferocity that suggested hunger, and a territorial confidence that suggested centuries. We abandoned the idea of holding ground. The retreat was a scramble that would haunt me. A man we lost that night, Ramos, went down in a place where the snow was thin, and I heard the sound of a weight being marooned against limbs like a sack of grain. We fired until our magazines were warm and dry, and the muzzle stung like a foreign tongue. The thing we saw didn't die like a dog or a man. It retreated, not running, but folding its limbs into an economy of motion and slipping between trees like a shadow with weight. It left prints that cratered the snow and the earth. The smell of it lingered, iron and rot, and the cry it made as it left went through the team like a verdict. We lost 2 that night before we even made it back into open ground. Their names are exact in my mouth, Ramos and Whitby.
Neither was much more than a body to the record men later penned, but they were breathing, laughing people then. The way their gear sat when we wrapped them said what had happened better than any report could. Packs ripped open, radios untouched, hands twisted backward. The lieutenant swore in a voice that broke, and McCrae kept us moving with a gravity that made the rest of us small. We limped back toward the ridge where our original insertion point was supposed to be. There, the radio silence was a brick wall. Every attempt to call net status returned the same dead carrier. We tried to send a prearranged flare burst, a sequence that ham radio nerds might recognize as a hand-coded beacon, but the sky ate the light. At one point, a faint reply came over a handheld, not in voice but in a weird mechanical stutter. Then silence. Someone in the tree line answered us in a mimicry that sounded like our own voices echoing from a cave. It put a cold hand on the back of my neck. We didn't see another living person until we crossed a small ravine and glanced up to find a pair of men in civilian garb on the ridge. They were not soldiers as we knew them. They had the posture of hunters, and one of them carried an old rifle that belonged in a museum. They looked at us like people caught between 2 eras. The elder of the 2 raised his hands slowly, palms out, then tilted his head and said one thing: "You shouldn't be here." He wasn't surprised. He was not angry either. It was as if he had been waiting. We didn't stop to explain. McCrae forced a tight formation and signaled low-profile withdrawal, but the look and the hunter's eye lingered. He said the same thing again to Daniels in that thin, blunt way only those who've lived outside the grid can craft. They mark their ground. We were too busy trying to breathe and rhythm to answer with anything coherent. The hunter's presence was a mirror to the trapper's earlier warning. I could feel the thread stitch a story inside me, but the narrative was not one me and my map could read easily. We reached a small clearing where an old weather station sat half-buried in snow. The station's antennae were snapped, like someone's large hands had used them for leverage. There were signs of struggle, half-burned footprints, a scattering of canned goods. A patrol from another unit, 2 men in camo smeared in frost, huddled inside. They looked at us with a thinness that said they had seen things no one should have. One of them, a husky-jawed fellow named Cole, whispered that their observation post had been hit. Men missing, 1 man put up in the trees and then simply gone. He said it like you read a casualty in a file, steady, practiced, but his eyes were not steady. He reached for his radio out of habit and then relaxed when he saw it dead. By mid-rotation, the word spread like frost across a pond. This wasn't an isolated incursion.
Scattered patrols were returning with stories that matched ours. Large tracks, bodies that looked mashed rather than pierced, and that noise. We compared notes in half sentences because whole explanations were impossible, and we had been trained against telling stories. Everyone slept with one eye open. Men began to mention names they hadn't said in weeks, calling for people on the frayed strings of habit. Lieutenants and sergeants compared coordinates the old way, with pencil and map, since the electronics were mute. The pattern on paper was ugly, a ring of incidents spaced around a narrow stretch of interior. The first night of contact broke the unit, not physically, though it hollowed our numbers, but in the way nights are supposed to knock the edges off a man. We rationed morphine in the med pack because numbness made the cold less loud and the images less precise. McCrae wrote down each name of the dead on a small slip, like an altar list. He folded that paper twice and slipped it into his chest pocket. The lieutenant tried to press a report up through channels, but each burst we attempted returned nothing. That silence was its own kind of pressure. We were ordered to proceed south, back toward a forward garrison where we could get extraction if needed. The plan, said in clipped voices, was to consolidate patrols, form a larger screen, and request overhead recon. But reconnaissance from the air was useless in battery-dead conditions, and the Blackout seemed to gag anything with a motor. We moved under the long sky, cutting between trees and trying to keep our footfalls light. At times the darkness pooled like oil between trunks, and in that oil-like dark I would swear I could see shadows that didn't match any creature I've catalogued. We had a narrow lull when we passed a frozen stream. The world suddenly felt ordinary, water under ice, the smell of spruce sap, and we allowed ourselves a few clumsy jokes. That's the dangerous thing about laughter in bad places. It snaps you back to life and makes you forget you are fragile. It was during that lull that we found the carcass. Not a man, not an elk, something smaller, maybe a dog-sized animal, but its hide had been stripped in a manner that implied deliberation and a certain contempt for the creature's life. The pattern of removal was not for feeding. It looked like a study of muscle and tendon. The smell was harsher here, not just iron but a fetid tang as if decomposition had been slowed and preserved in the cold. The sight of that small thing, picked clean in a clinical way, made something inside us tighten. McCrae knelt and touched a strip of hide with a gloved finger. It came off with an ease that suggested a precise technique. We kept moving south because that's what you do when you are ordered. You do the thing you are trained to do, even when it conflicts with your guts. The team rotated watch as if sleep would be a help.
At 2 a.m, when the sky was a dull bruise and the stars were faint behind clouds, we heard a sound I'll never gag away. The sound of something large moving with a hush like falling needles. It wasn't stepping so much as sliding. The trees barely sighed. I remember locking eyes with McCrae, a tiny signal with the hand. He took the point. We had to go back, not forward, to find the lieutenant. Daniels had been the last to radio, except there was no radio, and the last we'd seen him he had been kneeling by a set of prints that branched toward a hollow where the trees bent inward like a mouth. We moved as if the cold had become a thing we could use, slow, careful, the sound of our breath caught like small animals. Daniel's tracks went into the hollow and stopped. There was no sign of a struggle. The snow nearby had been compressed as if someone had dropped a boulder there, and then the boulder stood up and walked away. His pack lay a few yards from the hollow, unzipped, contents scattered like a child's toys. His gloves were turned inside out. We called his name. The wind filled it and carried it away. We found the mark on the tree nearby, 3 parallel gouges at a height that matched Daniel's chest, but far wider. McCrae knelt and pulled a ribbon of cloth that had been snagged. It had traces of frostbite and some fibers that didn't match any material in Daniel's kit. He held it up to the light and said nothing. The sky was a sheet of quiet above us. That's where we saw the outline of a figure between 2 trees. At first it might have been a trick of moonlight, an odd branch, a shadow. Then the figure stepped forward, without sound, long-limbed, white against white, and everything we had learned about engagement fell through like old rope. It stood there and watched us as if it had been waiting for a shape to form in the snow. Its head tilted with a kind of curious attention most predators reserve for prey that's playing dead. We fired. The tracer burned short, and the rounds pinged off something that rustled like clothing at a distance. It wasn't deflection. It was the momentary sting on a leg that does not stop a charging animal. One of the rounds caught it in the shoulder, and for the briefest, it moved with a surgical force. The sound Daniels made when he was taken was a single, uncomposed human sound. Then it was gone, muffled by the world. We ran. We ran with a kind of panicked order, firing wild and throwing flares into the trees. The flare's light revealed shapes, like pale men hoisting a burden, like poles carrying something heavy. Every flared second confirmed the inexorable thing we'd seen. They worked with purposes beyond the immediate. They lifted, they broke, they left marks. There was a method in their destruction. I couldn't square that method with the idea of mindless beasts.
We reached the open with the echoes of Daniel's last breath folding into the wind. The men who remained moved like ghosts around the 2 we had lost. McCrae sat for a long while and looked at the horizon where the forest ended and the sky began. He said, finally, that the mission hadn't been so much as snapped. "We get out," he said. "We get back to the garrison and we tell them what happened. We get eyes in the sky." Only the eyes weren't cooperating. Our appeals were blunt and practiced. We signaled with mirrors, we fired flares, We used prearranged codes, phonetic and succinct. Nothing outside of the static answered. The silence grew like a pressure in the bones. Somewhere along the ridge we met another team, larger and ragged, faces carved with the same blankness we'd been wearing. They'd had losses too. They had seen tracks like ours and, more disturbingly, marks on bunkers that were like the branding of some animal we hadn't cataloged. One of their men showed us a piece of material he'd found near the perimeter, a leather strap, old and stiff, with crude notches cut into it like tally marks. Where there had been jokes earlier, there was now an economy of words. You meet other men in the field and the conversation becomes currency. We compared the list of missing. Their commanding officer, an older colonel with a face like a map, looked like someone who had seen too many things in his life and had learned to hold them. He didn't say a lot. He asked a few questions, noted coordinates, and then did something I didn't expect. He called in a mortar barrage on an area the men had pointed out as having consistent tracks. Whatever hope we harbored that artillery would discourage whatever was out there was ancient and sentimental thinking. The barrage made no difference in the pattern of sound in the trees. The effects on the attackers were difficult to evaluate. We found later that mortar shrapnel had left skinning on a limb and a smear on snow, but no smoking, no burning nests. It seemed to only irritate them. I am not a man of many superstitions, but facing something that didn't fit into our taxonomy pulled at old stories the way a tide pulls at a shoreline. I found myself thinking of the hunter and the trapper, the way they had seemed to carry an old private knowledge like a tool. They knew things we had not been taught. McCrae wanted a clean answer too, but his path was different. He wanted to analyze, to drive a logic into the night. We argued about moving fast versus moving carefully. Daniels had argued for caution before he disappeared. His last decisions bobbed up like a ghost in our debate. What good was caution when the world had been recast? We consolidated with other patrols around a small clearing where a radio mast, old and brittle, jutted like a hand through snow. Men gathered, numbers reading 12, then 20, then more, as stragglers and injured arrived.
The colonel organized us into a perimeter that made use of natural terrain and the few remaining sandbags. We posted men at fixed intervals and rotated watches. It was basic and almost comforting, a return to the simplest patterns of defense. We set up trip flares and listen posts. The silence after the watches felt like a held breath. At one point, during a 2-hour lull before dawn, I walked the perimeter alone. The sky was thin and the half-moon hung like a pale coin. I went because being alone with the cold keeps you honest, and also because movement steadies the tremor in your hands. Near the edge of our perimeter, I found signs that someone, or something, had been very close to our camp. There were long grooves in the snow between our tents, like something had studied the lay of our sleeping men and picked at their seams. A strip of canvas had been pulled back from a bunk, as if whoever had done it was sorting through dreams for objects. There was no immediate violence there, only an examining that felt invasive. The moment proved more unsettling than a direct attack, because examining implies interest, which implies thought. I pocketed a scrap of canvas and returned. Around the last watchfire, a few men sat with their heads bowed. Cole passed out a thermos, and folks took the heat like a sacrament. McCrae came over, and I handed him the scrap. He ran his gloved thumb over it and then folded it into his palm like a confession. He didn't say much. He kept his eyes on the trees. I could tell he was making a calculation, whether to hunker down until extraction or to move north and attempt to outpace whatever it was that had learned our patterns. I don't know what gave him the idea. Maybe it was the look on the colonel's face when he received a single terse radio reply in the clear for the first time since the blackout began. It came as a voice, low and bureaucratic, asking for a status report. The colonel answered with controlled brevity, casualties and containment. The voice at the other end asked if we were requesting aerial support. The colonel tried, and for a moment we had hope. Then the reply came back in the same clipped voice. Negative. Environmental conditions and risk assessment do not authorize overhead assets. It was the kind of official answer that feels like a slap. It also felt like an instruction to accept the world as suddenly contracted. McCrae's decision to move wasn't theatrical. It was a trade-off. If the higher echelons would not send help, then the only help was to consolidate with the garrison we had been heading to. The heat of that calculus was this. Movement reduced our target density for whatever stalked us, and consolidating meant fewer exposed positions. The cost was crossing terrain we didn't control, and moving through places where the tracks told of watchers. We left at first light, a ragged column with people whispering coordinates and names like rosaries.
The sky was a cold, hard sheet, and the trees cast long, narrow shadows. We moved with an ache under every step. We had only gone a mile when we found signs of a larger presence, multiple sets of tracks converging in a fan,
burned branches at the base of a stand of spruce that looked like someone had scraped fire across the snow, not for warmth, but like a boundary line. Someone had left a single stone on a stump, a crude cairn. The colonel studied it and said nothing. His silence was heavier than any theory. We were halfway between the site of Daniel's disappearance and the garrison when the first of the other patrols ahead of us, men from a unit we'd never met, appeared running down the line, their faces wet with frost and their hands empty of questions. They spoke of a garrison at the edge of the inlet that had been hit and abandoned, of men taken from bunks in the night. They told us in a voice that shortened the syllables that the attackers didn't waste bullets. They seemed to know exactly where to strike to disable a man. Their commanding NCO swore that the creatures, he didn't have a better name, left no dragging or blood trails beyond a faint iron scent and prints that stamped the earth cruelly. Our consolidation plan became emergency extraction. The colonel radioed again. He did not get the formal refusal this time, but a delay, a bureaucratic stutter about appropriations and conditions. Meanwhile, we calculated our march toward the inlet where landing craft could pick up survivors. The decision felt less like a plan and more like a necessity. The hazard map in my head redrew itself into corridors of risk and opportunity. We were about to move when something happened that changed the geometry of fear entirely. A distant sound, like a chorus of metal on ice, rose from the tree line, as if every branch in the forest had been brushed at once. Men froze because their training told them to freeze at first sound. Then a low, long, answering rumble rolled through the clearing, a sound that vibrated in our shoes and down into the marrow. Someone started a flare automatically, and the world lit up in a shallow, harsh red. In that light, the trees were full of shapes, pale, bulky, shifting between trunks, and they were closing. We were not prepared for what came next. They didn't rush in a single tide. They tested us. They took down our outer posts with a speed that suggested coordination. A man we'd known for 5 years, Hector, was grabbed and lifted without so much as a shout. The way he went up made the rest of us feel like small things in a child's hand. McCrae ordered us inland, toward the fold of terrain the colonel had marked as our fallback. We ran with the feeling that a net had been thrown over the world. The first night engagement concluded with men broken and shelter torn open. We counted heads and hands in the gray light, and the math was always wrong. There were more missing. We had to leave before dawn in order to move with cover.
We packed as fast as we could. The colonel's face had the sheen of a man who knows his options are running out. He gave orders in soft commands. 2 on the flank, 3 on point, keep eyes low, conserve rounds. He handed each man a small folding card, and on it he'd written coordinates he wanted kept to memory. We left the clearing under a light snow, moving toward a coastal line where the land dropped away and the sea promised open space. The tracks behind us told a story of pursuit and of boundary. Every once in a while we'd find a fresh print, the wide impression flattening the moss. It would stop at the edge of a small stream, and then, inexplicably, the prints would return in a different direction, toward the north, as if our pursuers had made a decision to spool out and leave a ring rather than finish us where we stood. We reached a ridge that looked toward the inlet in the late afternoon. From there we could see the narrow ribbon of water and the hint of a dock, a place where craft could have tied. The sight of the water unbuckled something in the men, a tidal hope. We started down a path that took us past a small hunter's clearing, where we found something that finally told us we were not alone in our horror. Pinned to a post, a crude array of stakes had been erected, bones, strips of hide, and what looked like old tools wired together. There were marks scratched in the wood, longies like tally marks, and a small faded symbol painted in red. The trapper's earlier silence came back to me like a memory of my own childhood, the place where a community marks its lines. The symbolism was exact and raw. This was a boundary sign, a sign that someone had meant to warn others away, not with words, but with marks that read like a recipe for survival. We hesitated, because hesitation can be fatal. The colonel touched the symbol with gloved fingers and didn't bring them back in surprise, only in a flat, resigned motion. "They're telling us it's theirs," he said quietly. None of us wanted to argue. We were already on borrowed time. We pushed down toward the water, and the sea opened like a promise. Boats sat idle at the dock, some military dinghies, some civilian skiffs. They'd been abandoned in haste. The idea of men leaving them and not returning was a thing we all tried not to imagine.
At the far edge of the inlet, we could see a bit of smoke, a thin vertical that meant habitation had been very recently occupied. The colonel ordered a 2-man recon to the water's edge. McCrae turned and pinned a map to the inside of his jacket and scribbled a few notes. We were tired in a way that stopped the body and left the brain on wheels. We were a hair's breadth from the water when the first set of calls came in. 2 bursts, like the bark of dogs. They were the radio calls of a patrol we hadn't expected to see that close. The men who answered were frantic. Their language was clipped and incoherent.
One of them, a man named Travis, pulled us by the sleeve and said, "They've taken the pier. They took the pier last light. Men taken while sleeping. Boats cut loose." His mouth worked like he was trying to swallow words. He handed us a scrap of canvas with a symbol we'd seen at the stake, the same crude red markings. We should have taken that scrap and burned it. Instead, we read it and felt an emptiness in our chest that belonged to fear. The colonel radioed the garrison and finally got through. They asked for coordinates and casualties. The colonel spoke them in measured terms and then closed the patch. He held the radio a moment longer, like a man waiting for a verdict. The verdict came slowly and in the form of one of the coldest sentences I've heard from men in suits. No overhead support. Environmental risk. Evacuate to the southern rendezvous point. There was a long breath afterward. The colonel looked at us and said, "We move at dusk. We push for that rendezvous. Keep your heads down." It was the kind of order that meant we'd be doing the risky part of someone else's calculus. We moved then, because that was all we had. We pulled up axe tighter and stepped south, like the world was offering a small mercy. The coast and the sky. We didn't get half a mile before the sound came again, a rasp like stone grinding across ice. It was so close that the air took on the metallic tang we had become sick with. Men stopped with 1,000 different small frozen motions, a shoulder shrugged, a hand reaching for gear, a face turned. Above the noise there came a long cry that no human throat could have made. It vibrated, and then settled. It seemed to be claiming the night itself. We were caught then at the edge of action. The ground ahead was a slope to the inlet, and the field behind us had tracks like a ring. Men moved in individual fates, some facing the thing with rifles braced, and others sneaking like hunted animals. McCrae looked at the men, then at me, then up the slope in that way he had of gathering small certainties into an order. "Hold for my mark," he said. His voice didn't shake. That steadiness is contagious. We braced. I should tell you what happened next. I should lay it out in clean detail and give meaning to the terror and the small heroics. I should tell you that we fought, and that we beat back the thing, and that we earned our return. I should tell you that the garrison came and took us home, and wrote our names in ink on neat reports. I should tell you that the losses were rearranged into neat categories, and that the world accepted the new story with polite sympathy. But that isn't what happened. We were only just beginning to understand the shape of the threat, the economy of its movements, and the way it forced us to rethink what we had been taught to fear. There are moments burned into my mind, McCrae's hand on my shoulder like a compass, a flare arcing and revealing a long, pale limb, the sudden absence of a man's breath.
There are also things I can't reconcile. How a thing that left tracks like the teeth of some giant could exhibit tactics and patience. How an animal that moved with the brutal speed of a predator could also leave marks like warnings. We held our breath at the top of that slope, waiting for the tide to turn. We had not yet counted the cost of holding ground against something that measured the world differently. The lights of the rendezvous point were still a pinprick on the horizon, and the night had deepened into a presence. I remember thinking, with a stubborn, useless clarity, that whatever happened next would be the thing that would decide whether any of us at the end of that night would still be men who could sleep. It decided everything. The slope gave way under our boots. The snow was a thin crust over swamp in places. It sang under weight and then collapsed with a wet sigh. We moved in a ragged wedge. Flares hung ready on clip lines, rifles up, eyes trying to be more than machines. McCrae counted quietly, fingers working like a man untangling wire. There were still too many blanks in that count. They came in waves, not a tile rush, but a measured encirclement. At first they tested with a sound, a low hum that made the hair on my forearms stand straight as bayonets. Then they would strike a point. A man at the flank would be grabbed and pulled back, a narrow pulse of struggle, then silence.
We learned quickly that a direct line of sight meant little. They used the underbrush, the trunks, the slope. Once they had someone, they didn't expend themselves. They retreated, folded, and returned as if calculating the best angle to apply pressure. I remember the light a flare threw into the trees, and how the shapes that filled the trunks weren't blown by panic so much as rehearsed. They moved with a rhythm, feint, probe, take, like hunters with a map I couldn't see. They understood choke points. They pulled at canvas and straps. They tore. They picked. They broke a man and left what they didn't want. When they touched a radio, it would buzz once and fall quiet, as if whatever brushed the circuitry also silenced the intent to call for help. We couldn't hold the slope. We fell back, dragging injured through crust and root. Whitley weighed a thing with his hands and then stopped moving. His face had the faraway look of someone who watched a funeral from the wrong seat. We laid him out behind a fallen spruce and tried to make him warm with breath and the skin-to-skin trick we were taught for hypothermia. Those tricks didn't count for what had been done to him. The line between cold and pain blurred into one long ache. At the bottom of the ridge, the inlet opened a gray wound in the world. A few boats still clung to the dock. Men who had hidden among crates and reels of rope came out with faces like they'd been carved from the night.
They pointed with fingers that didn't shake and told us where the boats had been cut loose, where planks were missing, where the pier smelled of iron and old smoke. The colonel moved like a man balancing a map of outcomes. He watched our faces. He watched the trees. His mouth kept saying the same thing. Control the perimeter. Consolidate the injured. Get names. It's odd how small rituals hold in catastrophe. Someone slid a cigarette in his mouth and never lit it. A man blessed himself quietly. McCrae closed his eyes for a second and then opened them as if a switch had been flipped. That small mechanical act, breath in, breath out, kept us from unspooling and to scatter. We organized a perimeter tight against the dock, using the little that sheltered us: sun-split crates, a rusting winch, a collapsed tarpaulin. We posted men with instructions half-phrased and motioned for suppressive fire should anything appear in the tree line. The colonel designated 2 men to run the outer sweep and a small team to attempt to swim out to a skiff if it was still seaworthy. They left with hands that trembled and returned 30 minutes later, empty-handed, mud-streaked, and with faces that had learned a new kind of despair. The water along the inlet was an edge. It smelled of brine and the distant diesel of an engine someone had tried to coax alive. No one wanted to be the first to test whether those creatures respected that edge. Then they opened the garrison. The attack on the garrison wasn't a single strike. It was a sequence of small catastrophes. A stovepipe lit a tent. Someone tripped on a can and made a sound, and the sound became a place of interest. The creatures attacked where infrastructure was most brittle: bunks, tents, the mess line. They seemed to know to hit where men slept and where men kept their eyes closed. They moved to disable the few crew-served weapons we had. A mortar tube that had done us little good was pulled from its mount and then smashed in a way that suggested strength rather than thoughtless violence. There are images I can't get rid of, flashes I cut away from at night with the practiced violence of someone trying to edit their memory. One is of a man slumped in a doorway, his body bent in a way that made no anatomical sense. Another is of a pile of boots lined like graves, as if whoever had taken the men had left their footwear as a message. When the flare arcs made the world red and then gray, you could see the prints press into the ground and the stubble of frozen blood that refused to darken in the cold. It looked like someone had painted the land with their impatience. We fought with the discipline we had. We formed hasty corners, laid down suppressive fire, and used the few flares we could afford to burn. Bullets thudded into fur and hide, and sometimes into something that sounded like bone. The creatures retreated and then reformed, learning, adapting, always returning a step ahead. They didn't scream like an animal when hit. They made a small, high sound, almost like wind running between wires, and then folded themselves into cover. Once, one of them came within arm's length of me. Its hand, broad and thick, pressed into a tarpaulin and ripped it like paper. I saw its face then, up close, pale, not quite skin the color we'd be taught to call human, and a flat mouth that didn't move. Its eyes were deep-set and still. It looked at me like someone checking a ledger. By the time we realized this was a concerted assault, planned, coordinated,
We'd already suffered more losses than anyone could count without crying. Bodies were dragged into cover and taken. Sometimes all there was left was a bundle of clothing and a radio clicking on dead frequencies. At one point, the colonel called a halt and had us pull back into the boats at the inlet. Loading men hurt with frostburn and broken bones onto a skiff by torchlight felt like a ceremony of surrender. Boats cut loose, and the water took our silhouettes. We shoved off, engines coughing, men in every face. The evacuation was a messy intelligence operation. Boats moved in small numbers, then larger brigades arrived, some civilian, some military, all improvised. The creatures didn't follow into open water. There was a boundary they respected. It could have been visibility, the smell of salt, or a behavioral inhibition we couldn't name. They went to the edge, to the tree line, and filled it with white shapes that craned and considered us, as a herd might consider a fence. One of them, smaller than the rest, approached the water's edge and stopped with hands on its knees, as if reading our leaving. It tilted its head and made a sound that we translated, in our hunger for meaning, to something like regret. We numbered survivors in the choppy bay. The colonel had us form a tally. I still know the hollow rhythm of those names. Ramos, Whitley, Daniels, called out and then swallowed. Some men we couldn't locate. There were thin things that the tide had taken, gloves, a helmet, the torn flap of a pack. I pressed my face into the collar of my jacket so the wind couldn't take the sound from me. One of the civilian skippers, a wiry woman with a face like dry leather, spat when she saw how we looked. "You soldiers," she said, "you don't listen to the old marks." Her words were small, but they landed like a stone. When we finally reached the southern rendezvous point, the extraction area was a spin of logistics and bureaucratic patience. There were helicopters scheduled, but schedules don't cut through the kind of confusion we carried. A man from command, the kind with a tie despite his practical boots, took down names. He asked questions with a clipped politeness. The colonel tried to speak plainly, to lay out the phenomenon we'd witnessed. In return, we got the official tone. "We will investigate. Temporary measures are in place." It was the voice of the machine, careful, courteous, and slow.
The debrief took place under a fluorescent halo in a building warmed by machines. I remember how ordinary the room looked, and how a chair held a man as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The colonel's face had the fatigue of a man who had counted his men and found his abacus short. He told the room what he could say. He left things out that the men who'd seen it couldn't. Names, dates, exact sequences, and stuffed the rest into phrases like hostile environmental conditions and predator activity. There was a level of refusal there that didn't require malice so much as a desire to keep the world tidy. They filed reports, the colonel signed things, and the papers took on a sterilized life of their own. We were told to stand down and to report our weapons and personal equipment. An officer who smelled faintly of aftershave and formality told us we were to be briefed by a medical officer and then cleared for reassignment. The medical officer questioned us about frostbite, sleep deprivation, and stress. He wrote words in a book and asked us to rate our mood on a scale that felt absurd next to the image of men taken from bunks. I tried to tell him about tracks like snowshoes pressed into peat, about the way a man could be lifted like a doll and not a sound left, about the smell that clung to the undergrowth. He paused, and then he wrote something that wasn't what I'd said. Not everyone bought the tidy responses. The colonel took the paper and looked at it like it had betrayed him. He sought an audience with higher command, and I sat in on some of those moments, because you don't stop paying attention after the worst of it. There was a conference line in a windowless room, and men in uniform moving through statistics. Someone spoke of operational security, and someone else said public panic. The colonel argued for transparency, for a field investigation that would go unafraid into the interior. He was told to limit the language. He was told that the region had sensitive wildlife, and to symbolize the casualties in ways that favored nuance over narrative. I didn't understand then that institutions defend themselves by reframing truths, but I saw it happen. Casualties became unaccounted for. The creatures became unidentified animal activity. The colonel's pleas for aerial recon became deferred pending safety briefings. The people in suits spoke faster and softer, while their policies moved like glaciers, slow, sure, and devastating in their indifference. We were put through interviews with men who asked us about our dreams and about whether we'd drunk that night. The impulse among some was to make the story smaller, shrink it until it fit into the categories the bureaucracy could swallow: stress reaction, misidentification, environmental hazards. They were not malicious in the main. They were frightened of the consequences of a larger truth.
A truth like that invites questions about jurisdiction, about resource allocation, about what to tell families. Better to praise courage and list casualties under an unremarkable title. Still, the paper trail didn't entirely lie. There were photographs of tracks, of gouged trees, of the torn canvas. Lieutenant Daniel's log had been recovered, waterlogged and almost illegible. McCrae kept small written notes too, the folded list of names he'd put in his chest pocket. Those bits of evidence, the ragged artifacts the beasts left behind, could not be fully erased. They existed like embedded splinters. The official communique that filters into public channels was a pale thing. There was a press statement that read like a diplomat's condolence. Hostile wildlife engagement resulted in casualties, it said, or words to that effect. Families were told they'd been lost to the elements or to an adverse encounter. The paper in the newspaper in town used a grainy photo of an empty deck and a boat. People asked questions that were answered with careful tones. Local elders told stories to anyone who would listen, and were met with the kind of condescension reserved for those who carry the old maps and the old marks. It was simultaneously devastating and expected. We were encouraged to forget, not politely, not with any blunt command, but through the soft machinery of paperwork and reassignment. Men were sent to duties that kept their bodies moving and their heads occupied. Some of us went home, some went to training courses. I was allowed leave, and in the quiet of a small apartment, I found the story had not left me. It nested like a weed under glass, persistent, poking through. I tried to make sense of responsibility then. We had been trained to conquer, to map, to make use of the terrain. Here was a place that did not want us, and whatever was in those woods had written its rules on the bark. The trapper's phrase, "Don't be out there when it's quiet," played on a loop. I thought of the stakes nailed to the post at the hunter's clearing, and how simple their message had been. They weren't superstition. They were cartography of caution. Years later, the records I could access were bureaucratic and drained of menace. Where I had expected a frank cataloging, there was euphemism. Meetings I'd sat through appeared in the log as closure operations. The colonel's pleas were footnoted and redacted. I learned the language of what it meant to have truth softened. Operational security, liability, public order. The thing I had seen did not change. The paper did. There were men who never returned to garrison life whole. McCrae, who kept his composure like a man holding a compass, retired early. I visited once, to a house by a river where he fed ducks in winter and watched the water like it might explain things. He had folded the small paper with the names into a box and shut it.
He answered my questions with the same weary precision he'd used in that night, but his face betrayed the distance that had no map. We carried them out the way we could, he told me, and that is the ledger I have. Other men carried the missing. Families asked for answers and received words that felt hollow. Some of the widows I met stared at me in ways that made me want to confess sins I had not committed. I told them what I could. I didn't tell them everything, because part of me still believed that speaking the whole truth could buy back a life. That belief was childish. The truth was not a currency you could spend to restore the punched-out center of a life. There were rumors for years afterward. Hunters claimed sightings near other inlets. A pilot told me of a sensor that returned anomalous thermal signatures off a mapped course. A child posted photographs on a forum of enormous prints by a thaw-streaked creek, too big for a man, and pressed into the peat like the memory of a footprint. Each piece of rumor had the same quality. It hovered at the edge of verifiable fact, a shadow of something that wanted to be true, but couldn't be proven to the satisfaction of institutions. The bureaucracy, in its own way, closed ranks and moved on. Not every reaction was denial. Some groups, people who study the strange or the unexplained, took our fragments and tried to build theory on them. They argued about origins. Some said a malformed endemic species. Others whispered of experiments or displaced wildlife. I watched these debates like someone watching a fire from a distance, fascinated for a breath, and then ashamed of my fascination. None of the guesses satisfied the simple questions that had kept me awake those first nights. Why here? Why now? And why did they stop at the water? I returned to the question of the boundary, because it's the only thing that gives a shape to their agency. In every contact we had, the creatures stopped at edges they didn't cross. Broad water, exposed tundra with no cover, places the human eye could see for a long distance. They moved through the folded world of the forest and the hummock, as if using the trees the way we use buildings. Cover, geometry, a place to plan. That suggests mind and territorial definition in the same breath. They were not simply beasts. They were something that learned and held ground. The temptation after such events is to find meaning. I tried to give it that shape for the families, for McCrae, for the men who didn't return.
I wrote down what I remembered, and I filed it away like evidence. I kept a journal, half buried in a trunk that I've dragged across 3 states and 1 country. The pages are full of details I hope to never be asked to prove. The way snow compacts under a particular kind of weight, the smell of old iron at the edge of a clearing, the sound a man makes when he knows he will not breathe again. Writing is a kind of sacrament for me. It is the place where I place the faces.
Tonight, when I tell you this, why I had to tell it, it's because words now are the only patrol I can run. Decades have not smoothed the edges of the memory. I get messages sometimes from people asking if the story is true, if they should trust the reports they find in odd corners of the web. I always answer the same way. I was there. I saw these things. What your institutions will tell you publicly, and what men see at 3 in the morning, are sometimes different languages. The latter is where the danger spoken in the hunter's marks lives. If there's a last lesson in all of it, beyond the obvious, that bullets do not make answers, and that the cold is not neutral, it's this. Listen to the maps people who live in a place have made before the government redraws lines to suit convenience. The trapper and the hunter don't have our radios, and they don't need our permission to understand where danger nests. They call things by the names their lives teach them, and sometimes those names are what will save you. I do not claim to know what the things that attacked us were. I do not claim to know whether they were animals, relics of some unknown lineage, or consequences of something we barely begin to know. I know this. Men went to bed and did not get up. Men who were brothers to me were taken. An official paper later would say, unaccounted for, and tuck the phrase in a drawer. That phrase isn't the truth. The truth is a set of prints in peat that don't match anything I learned on range, the smell in the trees that never left my jacket, and the way the world seems quieter in places I think of as out there. There are nights when I walk the same trails I once knew and watch the pattern of snow for a print that should match what my eyes saw. I am older now. Things hurt more, and memory stiffens in corners. I still dream of the tree line and wake with the taste of iron on my tongue. I tell this story now because the men we lost deserve more than an oblique sentence in a file. They deserve faces in a sentence, a small, stubborn candle in the dark. People who hear me sometimes ask if it's cowardice to speak, to break the hush the institution imposed, or if it's dangerous. I will not pretend the telling is without consequence. I also will not pretend that silence heals. So hear this and keep it simple. Do not wander into quiet woods at night thinking the land is empty, because it is not. Pay attention to the people who live there. Respect boundaries marked not for folklore, but for survival. They were never explained. They remain in my mind and in the peat, in the smear of frost on a snapped sapling, and in the notch of a crew symbol in a post. If you ever travel through that part of the world, and the trees fall silent in a way that feels like a held breath, turn back. If a local hunter tells you to stay off a certain trail at night, do it. Don't assume your technology will make you safe.
Sometimes the most modern thing we have, our arrogance, becomes what gives us away. I keep the small paper with the names in a locked drawer. I take it out sometimes and read them, because names are the last civilized thing we can give to chaos. I say them in my head when the wind gets that particular iron edge. I promise the dead this much, that someone will remember, that someone will tell the story, that the truth we lived won't be wholly edited out of the history they write. If you found this and it makes you curious or afraid, let it do both. Share it carefully. Talk about the need to respect local knowledge. Ask questions of your institutions. Polite ones will do, but also listen. There are lines on this map that aren't drawn by governments. They are carved in places where things still decide what is theirs. If you've made it this far and want the full account, if you want to hear more about the places we marked, the equipment that failed, the small human moments that didn't fit into any report, stay with this channel. There's more I've written down I can read aloud. And if you take anything from this, let it be a warning. The world keeps corners where something older than our charts still holds sway. Like, subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear that some places are better left respected than conquered. If you want sources or notes, check the links in the description for further reading and for the scattered records that remain. Above all, remember the names of men who never made it off the ice. They were never explained. They are still out there,